Space, the final frontier. And you know, sometimes its vastness is absolutely terrifying. Netflix is launching their new space movie, Stowaway. So should you hop on and watch? On a mission headed to Mars, an unintended stowaway accidentally causes severe damage to the spaceship's life support systems. Facing dwindling resources and a potentially fatal outcome, the crew is forced to make an impossible decision. Now, I'm not an astronaut, nor do I play one on TV, but when a show opens up with a scene of astronauts launching into space in a rocket or shuttle, their face masks are typically down. You know, just in case there's a lack of oxygen so they stay pressurized and all. But that's how Stowaway starts out. Masks up with some people shaking in their seats. The opening makes me have to suppress that realistic voice in my head so I can watch and see if this is going to be worth your time. So this was pretty hard to get into. Right from that opening scene, we meet some characters that don't feel too dynamic. There are odd behaviors for what I'd consider astronauts, especially those going on a long journey. Dae Kim throws up from motion sickness, Kendrick kind of hops up and down all cheery that they've docked with the station, and Toni Collette is fairly stoic. We watched them go about some of their routines, and I kind of liked the lack of dialogue when this was happening. We get to experience the quietness and maybe even monotony that the crew is going to live with for 2 years. The problem, though, with doing this at the outset of the film is that the story doesn't grab me, and more importantly, the characters don't grab me. This is the time for me to get invested and feel connected to the characters, but any of their interactions felt very stiff and forced. And I really like Toni Collette, Kendrick, and Dae Kim. I mean, when I see them on screen, I'm typically thrilled because each can bring different levels of emotion and skill to the story. Here, I think for the most part, they're being underutilized or maybe even restrained. Toni Collette is actually a wasted talent in this. She spends her time looking like she's gonna throw up from stress and sadness instead of looking like a decisive commander on a space mission that's gonna last 2 years. Shamier Anderson also stars in this, and I'm not familiar with his work, but he was the standout for me in this movie. He displays a full level of emotion, and in one scene in particular, I could actually feel as he was going through his feelings. So the crux of the story is that on the ship that the 3 astronauts are taking to Mars, there's an unintentional stowaway. This extra body takes up resources and also causes a complication that further just complicates their fate. At about the halfway point in the film is where the story really begins to find its groove. We were given some conflict and tension that had been teased by the soundtrack and by also some of the characters brooding. Once we reached the middle of the movie is when I began to just really get engaged in what was going on. The story and emotion had finally grabbed hold of me, and I was beginning to become invested in the narrative. Now, this isn't to say, though, that what was about to happen wasn't predictable, because it was. And not necessarily predictable in details, but in overall outcome. And because of how this story is, the predictability, it's a major drawback to the overall film. And there are some very odd one-sided conversations as Toni Collette speaks to ground control. We don't hear what they say to her, so it's like watching someone taking a phone call in your living room. Well, all you hear is the person in front of you answering questions or giving info and making some half-hearted reactions. I mean, we're literally missing half of the context. And that doesn't have to be a negative, though. I mean, we could rely on the actors to convincingly give us the full context of that conversation through the reactions. That just doesn't happen here. The dialogue is very stiff, and much of the time it feels forced and unnatural. And other times, though, it flows really well and feels like something that somebody would actually say. So I think the unevenness is what bothered me most about the dialogue. Now, the special effects looked really good. I loved the times out in space, and the way they filmed just made it claustrophobic and terrifying and extremely tense. I mean, you felt the danger of being out in space, even if for some reason half the time they weren't tethered to anything. And even though the special effects are good and there is some tension and anxiety that the story builds, and then even as good as Shamier Anderson was, the film as a whole just wasn't an enjoyable watch. So many of the scenes were filled with an emotion that didn't feel even plausible from characters that are supposedly trained astronauts going on this really long mission. And while I could kind of overlook that if it was the only downfall to the movie, the stiff dialogue and odd character dynamics simply compounded any issues that were already there. I wanted to like this, and I feel that there is a potential for a very dramatic and engaging story. The setup provides some opportunity for real tension and urgency, but a lot of it is squelched by the way that just everything plays out. There's no sex or nudity, some profanity, and not really any violence. I give Stowaway 2 out of 5 couches. So do you have a favorite space-themed movie? I really love Interstellar and The Martian, but there are also so many more that I enjoy. I'd love to know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.